Hello, my pen friends. In this video, I want to present to you a presentation that I created for the recent boot camp hosted by Frank and I in Sedona, Arizona. Autofocus. You've got a lot of different options within your camera, and in this presentation, I want to break them down to their simplest terms and make some recommendations for you based on your needs. So let's dive right in. First, we're going to talk about focus modes. This is where you're deciding basically whether or not you're in one shot or continuous. Let's start with one shot. AFS, also referred to one shot as I just said. This is where you're half pressing the shutter and the camera achieves focus or attempts to one time. And it's not going to try to refocus until you let go that shutter button and half press again. This is good for static subjects. And think about that, both static subjects and static photographers. We'll come back to that idea in a minute. Your other focus mode is AFC or AI servo, depending on your camera brand. You half press the shutter, the camera achieves focus, so right up to this point it's exactly the same as AFS, but then milliseconds later the camera rechecks that focus and, if necessary, adjusts. This is good for moving subjects, any speed, and if the photographer is moving. Then we've got AFA. This is a mode that is starting to disappear in some cameras. It's the camera deciding which of those two above methods should be used. It's dumb. Don't use it, especially if you have older DSLRs. Maybe in the mirrorless it's become a little bit more competent, but you are a better decider whether or not your subject or you are moving or static. So we're just going to skip right over that. And then we're going to talk about DMF just briefly so that you have an understanding of all the different modes that might be possible in your camera. This is direct manual focus. It allows you to do AFS, and then the focus ring should be live, allowing you to make micro adjustments. I rarely use that, but it sometimes can be helpful. And then finally, MF. Manual focus. This is where you are focusing via the lens ring. We're mostly using this for astrophotography or time-lapse captures where you don't want the camera refocusing during the shots. And I'll just say, from time to time on workshops, when we ask people to be or encourage people to be in manual mode for photography, we're talking about their exposure settings, not manual focus. We really encourage the use of autofocus. All of your cameras are capable of quickly and accurately autofocusing. Manual focus, as I said, only for astrophotography and time-lapse or some other kind of a special scenario. So some recommendations for those focus modes. Well, first up, AFS, one shot. This is when you and your subject is stationary. Pretty straightforward. Scenic view. There you go. Nobody's moving. You're not moving. The mountain off in the distance isn't moving. AFS is just great. And if you have the time, some of our cameras allow additional features that let you magnify during focus and really make sure that you are precisely nailing focus where you want. The other mode, AFC, AI servo. This is if you or your subject is moving, or if you're using a modern mirrorless camera. Modern mirrorless focusing systems work very well using AFC on static subjects. So I am a pretty big fan of leaving your camera, if you have one of the newer mirrorless, in AFC. Really, I only jump back to AFS if I need to make use of those additional features for magnification. That's not completely true. There are some times where it's a little bit of a holdover that I really stick to AFS for very static scenes. But generally, I find myself using AFC more and more often and not really having any downsides to it. Now let's talk about focus area. So the mode was whether or not you're doing one shot or continuous. That was basically the choice. Now we're talking about focus area. Where within the frame are you actually focusing? And this really starts to break down in language via the different models you might have. Sony, Canon, Nikon, Olympus, they might have very different terms used to represent the areas that you're focusing, but generally you have a couple of options. A wide. This is letting the camera decide over the whole image area. Maybe not quite the whole image area, but a large portion of it. And these are really for mirrorless. In DSLRs, you're much more constrained towards the center of the image area often. Just something to keep in mind. Wide, there's no decisions by you. You're saying, look at everything in the frame, figure out where you should be focusing. Zone. This is letting the camera decide, but over a smaller portion of the image. You move the zone. In Sony, I really kind of have a large zone that maybe about 3 of them take up the whole frame. Then you've got spot. This is a smallish point that you can precisely place to achieve focus. And finally, tracking. This is less area and more a mode within the area. This, once you start it, the AF locks onto the subject and should follow the subject. And we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail. Over on the right at the top, we have an example from Canon. The next is Sony. And then the last one is Nikon. Those are all from more modern mirrorless cameras. Those are their different AF areas. So let me make some recommendations for you on focus area. First up is wide. I'm really only using this with AFC and when I'm trying to capture faster moving subjects on maybe a little bit of a cleaner background and or offer unpredictable movements. We'll look at some examples in a few moments, but a bird flying across a blue sky. Wide, the camera is going to find that bird, that subject, and lock onto it much faster than you could by moving the joystick or moving a small focus point over onto the bird. So you're going to let the camera do this work for you. The reason why you want kind of a cleaner background is because if it's a messy background, some of these cameras are still a little confused about what's happening back there and could lock onto the wrong thing, causing you to miss the shot. So something to keep in mind. Zone, again, still with faster moving subjects where that continuous autofocus is useful, but you are able to have or need a little bit more precision. Or being lazy with landscapes. That's what I'm talking about when I'm saying more and more often with the mirrorless cameras, I'm staying in AFC and I'm just putting that zone over the area that I want to focus. And I'm finding it to be pretty accurate most of the time. Finally, you got spot. You should be using this with AFS in landscape and you are precisely placing the focus point. Do not use the old focus and recompose method unless you're using tracking where you can lock it onto a subject and recompose so that you know that focus point is stuck on the subject you want. And I want to go back real quick to, where is it? Wide? Oh my gosh. I want to go back real quick to wide and say one more thing. Even when you are letting the camera decide over the whole frame where to focus, that does not mean more is in focus. This might seem basic to some of you, but I want to make sure it's out there. Your area, the amount that is in focus in your frame is going to be controlled by your depth of field, which of course is controlled by your aperture, your focal length, your distance to your subject, not how many focus points or how wide of a focus area you're using. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Then we've got tracking with so many sub options. It takes a lot of practice, but it can give you some really nice results. So for example, Canon on the left, you have multiple different cases that give you options for how to track your subject, like tracking sensitivity, whether or not it should ignore possible obstacles. Think of a soccer player running across the field. They're going to intersect other soccer players, some of them moving in the same direction, some of them moving in an opposite direction. And the more sensitive to tracking, the more locked on that your camera could be. Your focus system could be. And then accelerating and decelerating, whether or not it should watch for those more unpredictable movements of your subject. Over here on the right, just an example of Sony. You don't have all these different cases. You really just say, be more responsive, jumping to other targets, or be more locked on. That's pretty much it. And now, since we're talking often about mirrorless cameras and people have them on our workshops and out there in the field, we have a lot of these newer autofocus technologies like IAF, where the camera automatically finds the subject's eye and will keep it in focus. We have Canon example screenshot on the right, where not only do you have people and animals, but you have vehicles as well. So the camera is going to do its best job to find the most appropriate place to keep the subject in focus. If it has eyes, it's going to focus on the eyes. If it has a front windshield, it's going to focus on the front windshield. That's kind of the idea. Most of these modes work best in AFC because most of these subjects are moving. And you want that continually refocusing system to be working. If you are finding yourself switching often, so for Sony, I need to determine whether it's an animal or a bird. Sony makes a difference between animal or bird. And so I'm assigning a button that allows me to switch back and forth when I'm on Safari. So that if I see some elephants up ahead, I'm going to switch it to animal. If I see a bird in a tree, I'm going to switch it to bird. That way it's going to more accurately have object recognition in its brain and find what it needs to focus. Many of you have a camera that has some customizable buttons, and you could assign that so you can switch back and forth easily. What am I talking about with IAF? If you have an older DSLR, you might not have seen this in action. So here is a quick example of IAF in action. It's just set to animal right now, and you can see that little green box finds the eyes as often as possible. And when it doesn't, let's just go back and play that again. When it doesn't, it reverts back to just kind of using the zone focus system, as you can see from the little icon over there on the left. And I am in that continuous autofocus. It works really, really nicely. And this is where we talk about gear not mattering. If you're going out and taking nice landscape shots, it really doesn't matter what camera you're using. Any camera in the last decades is going to allow you to come out and take beautiful shots. But if you're going on a wildlife specific trip, the newer cameras with these newer autofocus technologies really are helpful. They make a difference. When you know, without really worrying about it, about where your focus points are, if you have that IAF and you've got a little bird in a tree and it nails that, that's very helpful. So I just want to kind of put that out there in your brain. And as always, we're happy to make recommendations about whether or not it's time to upgrade based on trips that you have planned for yourself in the future. All right, let's talk about a slightly controversial topic. How to initiate focus, right? How do you make your camera focus? Shutter button, that's the default. That's how your camera comes out of the box. You half press it, focus happens. And every time you go to take a picture, you are going to trigger the camera to focus unless you switch it into manual focus with the lens. It's pretty straightforward. The shutter button, focus. I'm a big fan of back button. Why? Because it gives you more control. So many of us have customizable buttons or even a button that's already assigned on the back of the camera, a way to initiate focus. You take that away from the shutter button. So the shutter button only takes a photo. Technically, we should say it does metering and takes a photo. So I really like the back button because it's an easy way to wait for that perfect moment without worrying that the camera's going to refocus when you go to take the shot. Again, we'll get into some examples in a minute. Now, there are downsides to back button focus. It's easy to forget, and it takes a lot of practice early on to get that muscle memory of having to press an extra button to focus. But I think, in my opinion, the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. All right, let's jump into some examples. Here's this shot that I opened this presentation with from Katmai a couple of years ago. This bear chasing a salmon. I was using AFC, continuous autofocus, because the bear was moving very quickly. And I was using a zone, the white boxes representing that zone, with IAF. And so it nailed the bear's eye. One thing that I found interesting with my particular Sony is it will often see the ear as an eye occasionally. So this object recognition isn't always foolproof, but in many cases, the eye or the ear was good enough to keep what I wanted in focus. And then, of course, using the appropriate aperture so that all of the bear, when it's that close, is in focus is important. If I'd used just AFS in this example, I'd have one sharp shot of the bear when he began running, and then all of the rest would be blurry because the camera would not refocus as it moved. And this is just showing you here when it doesn't find the eye, it falls back to just kind of within the zone, focusing on whatever it can see. Now I described using wide. So here we have a bird against the blue sky. Very easy for the camera to quickly find this turn and put its little green dancing boxes on them, letting me know it is in focus. This is AFC or AI servo again, so that if that bird is moving backward or forward towards me in the frame, it will stay in focus. And I'm using the wide area, so that I'm just letting the camera look over that whole frame almost, and deciding where to focus. And IAF is on, but in this case, it was just a little fooled by the smaller object and just hard to see the turn's eye, so it didn't necessarily lock on. Sometimes it won't, but then it falls back to that continuous. Some of our cameras have a wide or horizontal zone that can be very useful to make sure the camera is focusing where you want. My Sony doesn't actually have this. This is a simulation. Nikon and Canon both do have these more narrow, wider, or horizontal as well. I'm sorry, or vertical as well. Autofocus zones. And again, it's up to you to think about your subject, how they move, and which method is best for you. In this, I asked Chris to hold out her strawberry ice cream. I switched to AFS because I was able to ask her to hold still. I was holding still. I didn't need to shoot this in continuous. And I was just using a medium spot to make sure that the ice cream cup was nice and in focus, and just a little soft background for Chris to be out of focus. But here's an example of a subject, an animal, that isn't doing a whole lot of moving, but I still switch back to AFC because I have no control over whether this creature is moving. In the last slide, I could say, Chris, hold still. In this slide, I can't say fur seal, hold still. So I'm back to AFC, and I'm using zone with IAF again. And again, making sure that that eye is in focus. And if I'm close enough, making sure that my depth of field is close enough that my depth of field is appropriate enough that the nose is in focus, even though the eye is the focus point. So just keep that in mind. Another example, I've got my nephew here, AFC. He was standing still in the field, but he's not always the best listener, or he wasn't at this age. And so there was some movement back and forth, plus that IAF with AFC just works really well, giving you continually feedback on how accurate it is, where it is placed, and whether or not it's grabbing what you want. It just works really well. All right, here's another example. This is AFC as well, but a smaller spot. We could make some arguments and discussions about this. Zone could also be possible. It's very likely the camera is going to grab onto lots of other things, and it's going to make it difficult to really find the bird when it's mixed in here with all of those little twigs and branches, some of them which are closer to the photographer than the actual subject. The subject is back in among the branches a little bit, and that's why you can tell these are out of focus. So I switched to a small spot here, but with IAF on and AFC, so that as that bird hopped around, I was close enough. You could see how shallow my depth of field is. I really wanted to make sure it kept that bird in focus. AFS would be able to get me one shot, but then as the bird moved around, I'd have to continually let go and half press again. In AFC, I can just keep that back button mashed down, and it's just continually focusing, and then I press the shutter to take a shot when I want. I do not recommend switching to back button focus when you head off on your first wildlife trip. It is a technique, a switch that you should make months before you have any kind of big critical trips coming up, so that you have plenty of time to practice. Here's another great example of why I love back button focus. I was up backpacking in the mountains in the Pacific Northwest. I spied my tent off in the distance through all these larches, and I loved how I could kind of frame it. I used a single shot with AFS. So I got a small spot on it. I even did magnification to make sure the tent was really sharp. I used back button focus to do that. And then I was able to move up and down. This was actually a really kind of awkward level for me to shoot at. And I was able to get focus at a very comfortable level and then just move up and down, finding the composition that worked best for me and took multiple shots without having to worry about the camera refocusing. And when I started this presentation, building it together, I was working off of Frank Stelgis' autofocus presentation from a couple years ago. And I just wanted to run through these examples real quick. This is more typical with a DSLR, so I think there's a few more examples worth showing here. We've got autofocus continue with 9 points fixed. That's very similar to what I was showing you with my bear. Over here, he has his two very well-behaved dogs. They're not moving anywhere. So he's using AFS with a single AF point that allowed him to thread through the grass here. And this is another example where I think back button focus would be great, because once you are able to get that focus, you don't need to worry about the camera accidentally grabbing focus again on the grasses when you're taking pictures. And as long as you're just moving left or right, or the dogs are turning their heads just a little bit, and you've set an appropriate depth of field for an appropriate, set appropriate aperture for appropriate depth of field, then you don't need the camera to be refocusing from shot to shot, which is helpful. Over here, this one always confuses people. You got clearly a moving penguin walking through the scene. Why AFS and not AFC? Well, this was set with a camera trap, where Frank was off in the distance. He knew where the penguin was going to walk, and he had pre-focused to that spot and then was able to fire off shots as the penguin walked through, making sure that it wouldn't refocus and accidentally grab something else in the frame, like the background would be very easy to do, as the penguin might be in part of it. The plane is another one that can be confusing. Here is a moving object clearly flying through this space. Why AFS? That plane is moving left and right. It is staying within your depth of field area. And you don't really need it to continuous focus. This is also where Frank and I would disagree some. I'd go ahead and switch to AFC just to make sure. Maybe as you follow the plane left or right, your area of depth of field would change a little bit. But in this case, Frank had set this shot up, was waiting for the plane, and knew that it would work in there. Now our next one over here, AFC, makes a lot of sense. That plane is moving directly towards you. It's moving slow enough, though, that Frank could use a single AF point, use the joystick on the back of his camera to nail where he wanted that to focus, and the camera's going to continually refocus as that plane comes towards you. And then little Hannah Banana, she is a great test of continuous autofocus and tracking systems. And so Nikon has an option called 3D tracking, where it really will lock onto those moving subjects nicely. And that's what we recommend to use. Okay, I hope you found this presentation helpful. As always, if you have questions, especially specific questions about the settings within your camera for an upcoming trip, scenery, wildlife, and you want a little help, just reach out. I'd be happy to point you in the direction and give you some advice. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.